And I guess we're live now.
Yes, it's still doing the whole, you're going live, but generally it's live while it's doing that, which is why sometimes we have an awkward pause at the beginning of these. But yes, hello everybody, and welcome to another Democratization. We're actually here, Trig.
Yeah, I know, we've gone through the war.
we have arrived.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put a quick note in chat for people to refresh. But yeah, generally, I think, I don't know, we've done okay with these. Oh god, it's been a long road.
It has been a hell of a lot of reading. I think if I were to be to give an honest critique, we were at our absolute peak. Coming through the end of the First World War into halfway through the 1930s, and both you and I have had a shit ton on since then. So things have been a little slower, a little less high tempo, but yeah, we're finally at 1950, or heading towards 1950.
Yes, we are. We're doing a little bit more of a focus stream this week. We're talking about 45 to 50, but we are specifically talking about Europe and the consequences for the peace in Europe, for the defeated powers. Because the next episode, we'll be talking about like the state of liberal democracy in 1950, quote unquote liberal democracy. Oh yes, for those who are confused, Ludovi did announce he was coming on today, but he got that wrong. It's always been the 7th. He's going to be here next week.
Yep.
We're going to be talking about violence in society, and its role. So that should be an interesting one. But no, I'm afraid Louis isn't on today, but he will be on next week. So do watch out for that one.
I'm as disappointed as anyone else.
I know. There's been a lot of, like I said, we've been very busy. A lot of confusion.
I got sent the clip or the stream and the timestamp going, look, Louis on with you tonight. He's called you some other guy. I was like, well, let me watch this.
That's funny. Yeah, because we're still kind of just off in the weeds, doing our own thing. But I don't know. I don't really mind. It's been interesting. We've been able to learn without too many people screaming at us. Normal YouTube things, we are still monetized. You can still join and become a member. That's one of the better ways to support us monthly. Links down below to the Discord, all that good shit. I don't think I've put a link down there. I am on Twitter currently using the shared account, but I don't know for how long, because we are kind of going ham.
Yeah.
There are some articles out on the Anti-Politics Substack, the one that me and Evelyn update. Evelyn has an article out about Ted Kaczynski, which is the full version of her Mallard article, because she was published recently in the Mallard. And I have released an article called Barking at the Headlines that's worth a click just for the Tim Pool meme in it. And it's one of my prouder memes, to be honest. It's a decent shoot of Tim Pool. So do check that out. Also, you can obviously send us super chats. We will read all those out on stream, and we will have Streamlabs popping up occasionally. So if that is the best way to donate to us, Streamlabs takes the least cut. I am looking into alternatives because Streamlabs is kind of shit, honestly. There are a couple of other kind of ones that let you donate through PayPal that are a little bit better than Streamlabs. So I am taking you guys' comments into consideration with that. And I am looking at backup avenues, things like Odyssey, although a lot of those, like I said, have underwhelmed me. And I know you've had a look at a couple too, Trig. I know BitChute was the big one for a while. BitChute's gone to shit. So we will try our best to make sure if we get yeeted, there's a place for us. But honestly, right now, we're backing up all the videos, don't worry. Nothing's going to disappear if we do get yeeted. But we are trying to figure stuff out.
The problem with the other platforms, it's not that. I mean, I've been on a couple of them now, doing odd little sort of streams with people, and they're okay platforms. It's just the fact that nobody knows they exist. There's, is there a point in doing a couple of hour podcast for fewer people than I could hang out with in the server and chat for that amount of time. That's
I'm gonna say, yeah.
That's where you start going. If I'm trying to reach an audience, just chilling with 10 people in a Discord server reaches more than some of these others. Sadly, at this point in time.
I will also cover the fact that the Nomos event in Manchester is still happening. It's all actually paid up now. We paid the venue. So that's like 100% definitely like fully financially sorted too, which is nice because we've almost sold out of tickets though. I'm not sure if that's in the description or not. I don't think it is. But if you guys want to check that out, I will put that actually in the chat because I will be doing. We're supposed to do it tonight, but Evelyn's been quite ill because she was going to send out the messages. But we have picked speakers, and I think they're being informed this evening, and those will be announced tomorrow, probably tomorrow afternoon. So yeah, the Nomos Manchester thing is still happening. It is going ahead, and we do have community speakers lined up. And I can actually safely announce it now. Count Dankula will be there, and he will be helping us basically MC the event and basically just occasionally telling jokes. We tried to give him a bit of a low pressure role since he's a dad and all that. So it'll mostly just be him hanging out. But
cool.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty cool though. It's in Manchester. I can be a bit more specific. It's actually in the print works in Manchester. If people are wondering for a more specific location, I've told a few people that. So there'll be more details on that via email probably tomorrow if you've bought tickets. So thanks to those people. I think there are only 8 or 9 tickets left, honestly. And there might be a couple more coming up for sale because we'll be refunding a couple of the community speakers who've already bought tickets. But like at most, there is 10 tickets. Once we've refunded a few people who are community speakers now. So that's that shilling out of the way, though. Let's actually get into the meat of the episode.
Yes, cool. You haven't done that. You haven't told people to like and subscribe and all of that lot either. But
they know that they're not fucking retarded, Trig. Stop treating people like they're retards. No,
it's I've had so much experience. It's difficult.
I don't know. Let's take a brief second to figure out where we are because we're currently in 45.
We are currently in 1945. The war has basically ended. FDR's dead. I think we did we say that with the last one?
No, we didn't actually. We talked about the consequences of the war, but we haven't talked about the fact that FDR's dead. Churchill is still doing some of the international relations stuff, but he's technically just been voted out.
Yes.
It's Clement Attlee now is the UK Prime Minister.
Yeah. You know what?
Sorry.
Part of me thinks that Churchill was done rotten there. He was not. That said, never good. He was never actually good as a peacetime Prime Minister. Churchill, but it did feel like he just won the war, and the public voted him out on the spot. Anyway, but
the thing is, he was essentially forced out.
Yes.
He was not welcome in peacetime British politics. We'll talk about it on the next episode. Mm-hmm. But what happened to Churchill is that his moment had essentially come and gone. And in a lot of these places, in the US, in France as well, though we don't have time to cover it, and especially in Germany and Japan, there is a massive break at the end of the war with previous tradition. You see it partially with Truman. I'd argue Truman is one of the better continuators, but you've got Clement Attlee, a Labour government in the UK, and you've got the complete destruction and occupation of Germany and Japan, as we'll get into.
Yes.
But it is a time of, 45 itself, it is bam, 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 just immense change once the war ends. Straight away.
Yeah, you've also got the continued destruction of England as well, and when the war was over, things that were in place, that had to be put in place because of the war, like rationing, for example, didn't just end in England. We were rationing in England for certainly well through the 50s. Even though, essentially trade lines were up and running again. England lost so much freedom, and there were so many temporary measures that stayed in place through the 1940s into the 50s, into the 60s, and are still there now. By and large. So it's not just the destruction of Germany and Japan; it was the destruction of Europe. Really, nothing was the same again.
We again, we'll talk about it in more detail next time. But the double whammy of the New Deal and the wartime politics with FDR, and the double whammy of the wartime politics of the UK and the Labour government, led to a very, very rapid period of change. We'll be able to get into it when we do, like I said, eventually when we do the post-democratization stuff. But what happens is that the war and the immediate post-war period are this frenzy of kind of agitation and change. And, if you read my article from this week, or if you again, chill. But if you want to read my article from this week, I talk about integration propaganda, which is the more subtle. It's the idea that you have to support the status quo, and there are always these periods of agitation, of change, and integration, of getting people used to the world that has now been changed. And we are not quite there yet, but we talk about the post-war consensus and all of that, because basically what's happened is what happens in the 50s is you have this massive period of sustained integration propaganda. Essentially, that's why people remember the 50s so fondly. It's not really because they were that great objectively, it's because there was less of the agitation phase in them. And I've started joking with people on a high level that most people are, they're just like, please put me back in the integration phase. It's very put me back in the Matrix. But again, that's a bit of an aside point. The big thing in Europe is the occupation of Germany.
Yes. The total obliteration of what was Germany. I mean, bear in mind, Germany had only been unified not 100 years.
No.
And so much has happened to it, and it is now, well, East Germany is gone. Thank you, Russia. USSR has gone chomp.
Not quite yet, though. No.
Okay.
The interesting point about this period is that there is so much uncertainty about the USSR, because in 1945 it's still Uncle Joe.
Yes.
It's still our ally. And retroactively, this is seen as the period of the build-up to the Cold War. But within period, people didn't know that shit was coming. There was the Iron Curtain speech, and Churchill is seen as one of the harbingers of it. But as we'll get to, it's only in 1949 that we get things like the Containment Doctrine. It's only in 1947 that people really start to create overt noises that they are even unhappy with Stalin. 45, 46, there's this elation and the continuation of the wartime situation propaganda-wise, that the USSR is our ally and really can do no wrong.
Yes, but that is about to change in a very, very big way. That is not going to last even another year. And as we know, as we discussed last time, that they were back of a cigarette packet dividing up things with Russia, even though a couple of months later, Uncle Joe would suddenly be, the great evil again. Which, to be fair, that might have actually been accurate. Joe Stalin was somewhat unpleasant by all accounts.
So, somewhat, yes. A bit of a rotter he was. A little bit of a rotter.
Bit distasteful, yeah.
But I think, as you see on screen, there's the partition of Germany and the partition of Berlin as well.
Yes.
Because Berlin is actually, by this point, pretty deep in the Soviet zone. And Berlin itself is administered in the same way as the rest of Germany is, and a very large chunk is administered by the Soviets, and the rest is divided between the Americans, the British, and the French. And this is the situation universally all over Germany. Berlin becomes a microcosm of what Germany is, in that there are these zones of influence. And it's very difficult, because this is just how history is taught. It's very difficult to realize that this really hadn't happened before in Europe. It didn't happen at the end of World War One.
What happened to Berlin, could not have existed in a world without air travel. Because you've got this little pocket of, the Western countries, Western occupied city, right in the middle of this Soviet occupied area. Whilst the wall hadn't come down yet, it was about to. Berlin was wild, and
you have to remember the Berlin Wall only went up in 1961.
Yes.
This period was of supposedly harmonious cooperation. The Berlin airlift only started in 1947 through 1949.
Yes.
But like I said, there was a lot of overt moves to try and keep the Soviet Union on side, and Germany is a great example of that. That there is these extreme overtures from Stalin that he doesn't want any part of this alliance anymore. He's saying it very, very clearly. And the Western allies are going, oh, wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to rule the world together. Wait a minute. And the friction between the powers is there already, but we don't see it communicate to the people very effectively until 49, really, until we see the talk of the containment doctrine.
I suppose.
But it's important to remember that Germany has ceased to be as a sovereign nation at this point.
Yes. It is a dead parrot.
Well, it's not just a dead parrot. It is a fully, this didn't happen after World War One. And a lot of people want it to happen, after World War One. That Germany doesn't have a government. Mm-hmm. Its constitution is suspended. It is, they're not just issuing demands and a government is reacting to it. There is no government of Germany. There are the administered zones, and that's it.
Yes.
Germany is now a globalized state. It is a ward of the victorious allies of the global war. And we talked last time about the elevation of sovereignty to an international level, that these countries came into a conflict as separately as different countries, but left as the allies and essentially declared world peace on VE Day. It is an extreme demonstration of power. It's also an extreme demonstration of power to smash and administer a country like this. Again, we just see it as historical fact, but the demands on the German people were incredibly, they were extreme during this. And it's almost seen as weird to talk about, it's sympathy for the Nazis, but these are ordinary Germans.
Yes.
These are, as we'll get to when we talk about the expulsion of the Germans in the East, a lot of these were people who didn't like the Nazis or even fled the Nazis when you get into Eastern Europe. And they are seen as the enemy personified. They are able to be treated in this way because they have been unpersoned and dehumanized. They have been created in the minds of the populations of the Western democracies. They are inhuman. They by voting for Hitler or by tolerating Hitler, they have lost all rights. They have lost all rights to their history. They have lost all rights to their sovereignty. They have lost all rights to self-administration.
Yeah, it's a bit horrendous, to be honest. And as you said, they didn't do anything wrong. They were just, it's, as always, the guys on the street, the people who were possibly fleeing the Nazis or just doing their thing, getting by every day, going, oh shit, there's a war in my country now. Well, that sucks. I didn't vote for this guy. Etc., etc. And then they have to put up with it. And yes, now Germans are persona non grata across Europe. I mean, even growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was always jokes about the Germans. Christ, what is it? Snatch. Good movie.
Yes.
The Germans are coming is a common joke in that film. That's the 90s. So this is it. The Germans had now become, well, another group of people that we could laugh at and take the mickey out of. So much for that.
They became these. In later years, they became these cartoon villains.
Yes.
Palagonius Ionis, I can't say that right in chat, has mentioned something very relevant, which is Operation Keelhaul, which is what I was going to mention lower down, but I will mention now, is that Operation Keelhaul was agreed to by the Western Allies. And what Operation Keelhaul was the repatriation of all Soviet citizens from Europe. Basically, the Soviet Union asked for their diaspora back, and Italy, Germany, the British, and the Americans agreed. A lot of this was prisoners of war, but a lot of the Soviet prisoners of war didn't want to go back to the Soviet Union. They wanted to stay in Western Europe, and the idea that that the Allies would just hand them back over as late as 1948.
God.
That they were still handing these people. Again, it shows the fact that the Cold War, Stalin was still their guy, and it was still their guy in some respects right until 48 in this case. Forced the U.S. Army actually classed the forcible repatriation of displaced Soviet citizens, Operation Keelhaul, as classified. It was a state secret. They were the victims of Yalta. Again, one of the terrible outcomes of the Yalta Conference, and another great surrendering to Joseph Stalin. But this is what was going on. This is what the Allies were still doing in the peace.
Yeah.
They were still, cooperating with Joseph Stalin, who is another genocidal dictator who they are supposedly against. We keep repeating this fact, but it's a great irony that we'll reach the end of this and we'll talk about Poland and the East and the sacrifice of the East. But Britain went to war because of the invasion of Poland. And at the end of World War II, they hand it back to another invading power.
Yep.
They essentially went to war for nothing. Because all they did was trade one land grab for another land grab.
Yeah. And
it becomes this very sorry state of affairs. But right now we're talking about another something that's different, but parallel to Operation Keelhaul, which is the expulsion and flight of German citizens from much of Eastern Europe. There's a little bit down here where it says reasons and justifications, and it's quite funny because Churchill as well was seen to have agreed. The proposals from the Polish and Czech governments in exile to expel ethnic Germans after the war received support from Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden. So two very high-up British politicians. And again, the great tragedy of this is that a lot of the Germans who found themselves in Eastern Europe, yes, some of them were settlers brought in there by the Nazis, but many of them were Germans who had fled the Nazi regime. The closest, land countries to Germany are, France and Poland. Yep. And a lot of people had fled into Poland in, 33 through 39 to escape the Nazi regime. We talk about, the Jewish diaspora in Warsaw, but we don't talk about the German diaspora in Poland, who, we don't know why they fled there. We don't know why they were there. And you have this strange reversal of fortune where the only Germans in Eastern Europe who have protected status are German Jews. It's this complete reversal of fortune.
Yeah. We're not going to get into it too much, but there is yes. There is a lot there to unpack as well. But,
I don't know. Were you ever educated about the expulsion of the Germans?
I wasn't educated about the expulsion of the Germans. No, that was a part of the Second World War history that I was not taught. Doesn't surprise me As I said, we were still sort of mocking the Germans. I mean, it's certainly, especially in the 80s and 90s, you took the piss out of everyone. But the Germans were to be ridiculed at all costs, and as you say, they were comic book villains. They're the villains of everything. I can understand that closer to the point. That Second World War was nasty. A lot of people had a lot of ill feeling and wanted to vent. Allowing people to vent by otherizing the general populace, or the German populace, and getting them to be ousted. I can understand how it happened. I can understand that as a, you know what, let's let the populace do this, let them, rather than them tear each other apart in some other way. It's a retribution against people that didn't deserve it. But, well, isn't a lot of history that kind of nonsense?
It's interesting because it's estimated that over 600,000 Germans moved to Poland between 1931 and 1939, presumably many of them trying to escape the Nazi regime.
Yeah, I perhaps. It's also interesting because you hear of things like the Danzig corridor, which I've mentioned before, and other sort of cases where there was possible ethnic cleansing by Polish of Germans, but Germany, Poland, etc., former Romance and sort of Holy Roman Empire states have got a lot of families and a lot of commonalities between the two. You might find there was a lot of people who thought themselves Polish living in Germany, just as much as there were a lot of people living in Poland that thought themselves German, or living in Austria.
They have a lot of common history with
German.
Bohemia
Exactly.
and the Holy Roman Empire. You are correct about that, and it's another tragedy of the redrawing of borders and the remaking of politics now by the Soviets, because this was really a Soviet program because they were in control of these territories. It mirrors Woodrow Wilson's redrawing of the map of Europe, and that you get these international powers who wage these wars, and these wars that are justified on the basis of democracy, and then you end up with just the mass suffering of people. And again, it's a point of history that it is people almost deliberately avoid, because you will end up being accused of being a Nazi for defending German civilians.
Oh yeah. No, certainly. Back in the 80s or beforehand, defending Germans for anything would be, what's wrong with you, dude? These guys did this. Don't know whether they'd call you a Nazi, because you know what, it didn't get thrown around much back in those days. But
No.
it's not like it is these days. No one knows the meaning of the word. But yeah.
Well, the one point I want to impress on people is that this is a non-continuation point for German civilization. That
Yes.
they only united into a country, like you said, in the 1870s, but West Germany and then later United Germany are essentially a vassal state of the global community to this day, in many ways. German history from 1945 onwards is a very globalized society. There were UK boots on the ground in Germany from the agreements from the Second World War. When do you? I know you've seen the notes, Trig, but if you hadn't, when would you think that presence would have ended?
Well, I know some of this because I've also got people in my family that are military. But yeah, no, Germany was being still occupied. Well into it's certainly the 90s. Because bear in mind, the Berlin Wall only came down in '89.
Yes.
And that's a very, very interesting one all by itself. Because having lived in the time, you'd 89 was a weird year. We'd got Tiananmen Square and the Berlin Wall happening that year, and a lot of things had cracked off, and all of a sudden, for no particular reason whatsoever, a lot of people jumped on the wall in Berlin and ripped it down. It was a hell of a thing, and suddenly, I mean, the communism was falling then anyway. But no, Germany was still occupied. You're gonna surprise me now because I'm not gonna look at it. I could do, but it was well into the 90s, I'm sure.
2020.
2020.
The British finally handed over control of their last sovereign military bases there in 2020. That was the last year, essentially, of Allied administration of parts of Germany.
Yeah.
From this date, from 1945 onwards. It happened last year.
And at this point, Germany is already well and truly part of the EU and not its own country anymore anyway. So Germany has never been a country since the Second World War.
Not really, no. I'd argue they're not a sovereign nation. They can't have an army that operates on foreign soil. We'll come to the even more restrictive version of that the Japanese have in their constitution still.
To be fair, not having an army that can be used on foreign soil is kind of the way it always used to be with most armies, and it was them invading that got people pissed off.
You know what I mean, though.
But yes,
there used to be international treaty reasons for countries to invade each other.
Yes,
you know the Napoleonic Wars and things like that. That Germany cannot take part in foreign wars.
Good
legally under international law. But other countries can, so it makes them unequal among sovereign nations technically. But that's I don't know. It's a weird distinction these days. Yeah, EU. That's also partially why Germany pushes so hard for an EU army. It's one of the only vectors with which it is allowed to project power.
Oh yeah,
or hypothetically could be. It would be the main, it would be far and in a way the major contributor to it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Magut is not incorrect in some respects. Certainly, the EU has allowed Germany to unite Europe under a German leadership.
Yeah. A lot of people make jokes about that, but it is somewhat true.
It does. Yeah, there's something to be said there. There's a huge amount of influence that the corpos have on the EU as well. It is.
Yeah, the
monstrously corrupt.
The other extraordinary situation in terms of occupation is Japan, which is arguably in a worse state than Germany was, even in terms of just mass destruction. Japan was used even more so as a testing ground for the submission of populations to bombing. Not only because of the 2 nuclear bombs that were dropped on it, but because of events like the firebombing of Tokyo. They basically do not have any industrial cities left. Japan has almost been bombed back to a pre-industrial stage.
Yes. I say that because the way Japan's industry runs, even now, and it might be in part because of what happened to them, is that Japan has huge numbers of shed industries, man with a lathe type stuff, which has allowed Japan and did allow Japan to jump straight back. But yes, by and large, massive factories gone, big cities firebombed. Japan, hell of a state, and also a lot of them wandering around going, holy shit, did you see that flash the other day? I've been seeing spots in my eyes for a long time now. Because they got nuked. They're the only country in the world that knew what it was like to get hit by a nuclear bomb. And, people saw it firsthand and lived. There are huge amounts of no amount of testing at Bikini Atoll could give them the results that they, the information that they got from those 2 bombs going off in Japan. Huge amounts of damage caused. That's got to damage the psyche of a nation for quite a long time, and
yeah, that's how we got anime. That's the joke, but
yes,
anime is their revenge. But no, the situation in Japan is slightly different in that Germany has no continuation factors. It is a blank slate. It is a completely, is a society that has been given its year zero. But Japan, because of the divine status of the emperor, what the USA decided to do was retain Emperor Tojo and use him as essentially a puppet for many of their reforms. Everyone else is gutted from the Japanese administration, but Tojo is kept as a semi-figurehead who then, subsequently kind of retires, and you don't really have the emperor anymore after that. But he is retained in the transitionary period, and especially the post-war period, because he is so vital to the Japanese psyche. Such is still their link to their past. But like I said, he is the only continuation point. The Japanese population is completely reliant on the US for basic aid. And there are tight controls on every aspect of life. There's still very large embargoes on Japan until the 1950s because they don't want certain types of industry taking hold and certain types of materials going in there.
Japan to this day can't have a military force. They, that said, have the Special Defense Force, which is a holy shit level tier funded police force. But
well, that's the workaround, yeah. It's worth. We're not going to talk about denazification today because we don't have time. Because that's an experiment that went on right into the 60s, and it's something we need to give its own episode to. Because denazification is the model that was used on Western societies in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
That is the test. That is where the Frankfurt School comes from. The Frankfurt School was originally envisioned to denazify German society, and it is the greatest example of what Hans Hermann Hoppe calls decivilization. Tojo is shamed, but he is still in place. Sorry, there's Mugruth there, but denazification is one of the kind of the telltale signs of how the elites work and how they have remade people's minds. It is the blueprint for what is referred to as a long march through the institutions, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer because the institutions were very much born of left wing as they were. Hoppe talks about decivilization in a lot of his work. He talks about in Democracy, the God That Failed, and The Great Fiction. I would look at the index of both of those books if you have them. I think we've actually referenced that term before.
Yeah.
But it's the Japan goes through a similar process of denazification. Almost, it becomes whether rightly or wrongly, it becomes a testing ground for imposing a Western democracy. Japan is rebuilt in America's image. And again, the irony of this is that this is about 100 years, not quite, but about 100 years after the Perry expedition, which is the famous American expedition that forced Japan to open up to trade and industrialization. Essentially, it's seen as the end point of the shogunate and the beginning of industrial Japan. This is only also as well 1945 is only 27 years distant from the end of World War I, in which Japan was ceded territory in China, which it was subsequently punished for in the Second World War, but it ceded territory in China by the agreements at the end of World War I. So, again, Japan is only 27 years distant from being America and Britain's ally that was rewarded with territory in a kind of territorial settlement. It is extraordinary that Japan is being given this treatment. It is extraordinary that, again, we weren't able to talk about it in great detail because I'm probably going to have to do like a Japanese episode at some point about Japanese democracy. It requires its own thing. But the sanctions on Japan, the economic warfare on Japan pre-World War II was really the aggressing factor that turned it into this hardcore military dictatorship.
I know a lot of people that served and fought against Japan in the Second World War. Came back very, very badly, not just disfigured, but mentally scarred. Fighting the Japanese was hard. The Japanese really put America and anybody else that fought them through the ringers. I wonder if that was part of why they were treated so harshly, that they literally needed to be nuked. They were that resistant and dared to fight the Great America, to literally initiate attack and then carry on fighting and fight hard for so long and deserving of the nuke. I wonder if that's why they were stepped on quite so hard. But
well, there's an article here, actually from the Japan Times, which is a contemporary view of the legacy of the US-led operation in Japan, because it still does resonate. It is the starting point, really, of their modern society, of modern Japan, much like it is the starting point of modern Germany.
Yes,
but Japan was. Oops, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say modern Japan is now basically a fairground ride of ancient Japan and modern.
Oh, sorry, I'm being retarded. It's Emperor Hirohito. Tojo was the head of the military government. Sorry, I'm having a brain fart. I'm a bit tired today. It was Emperor Hirohito who was retained, not Tojo, who was the head of the military government. I'm getting my jabs mixed up.
Fair enough. Yes, you are right. Hirohito was emperor. And Tojo was executed. Yes.
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 Sorry, I'm getting them. Tojo was not retained. Tojo was executed, but the emperor was retained. Yes. Hirohito was retained. Ugh, God, I meant to say Hirohito. I'm having a brain fart.
No, don't worry. I should have caught you up on that. But no, I'm apparently a bit retarded today too. Oh well. But yes, no. Japan was. How to put it? Yeah, they were culturally crushed. They've never been the same since. They are now a workaholic, industrialized blob almost. Their culture is it's horrendously sort of stressful for anyone looking in from the outside. Every time I look at the Japanese way of life, I see people working themselves to death and dying or committing suicide in their 30s. I don't know if this was the idea. It couldn't have been. Well, I know it's always been rough in Japan. I read the what's it? The Book of the Samurai ages ago, and it was a collection of stories of samurais. Yes, Japan's always been harsh. Japan's always had a culture of mistakes can be, literally fatal, probably via your own suicide. But yeah, no, literally stuff like a guy goes out with his mates, has a few drinks, decides to call it early, goes home to his wife. His mates get into a fight later on that night and get killed. So he finds out and immediately has to kill himself because he wasn't there for his mates. Is a story that struck me as this is wild. These are actually sort of samurai warriors. Half of them never even made it to battle. They had to kill themselves for something somebody else did. Madness. It was madness over there. So
madness, I tell you. Oh, we have a donation from Gaius Naughty Caesar. Thank you for the $5.
We do. Thank you.
He said, on the surface, we talked about denazification, yet we took all their scientists and research and made the CIA. We'll actually be talking. That's our next point. We'll be talking about that after we've talked about Japan.
Yeah.
We're not talking. We're just talking about paperclip and all that. So don't worry. In terms of this Japan Times article, there's just a little bit here I want to read, which is there's a little section that says what areas of reform were pursued. And there's a little section here that said the occupation also enacted land reforms that gave farmers and small landowners more rights. Trade unions were allowed to operate, and educational reforms created a school system based on the US model and encouraged the teaching of democratic values. Again, you might think we're crazy to object to that, but there's this one of the great lies of the post-war consensus is the neutrality of Western democracy. The Western democracy is a neutral system, a natural system, and it is an inherently good system. But what happens here is Japanese traditional society is smashed into pieces. And you must remember that a lot of the military government before the Second World War was put in place to stop a lot of this rampant, what they saw as destruction of, Japanese tradition. What you have here is basically the US recreating Japan in its own image. Japan is basically a Pacific outpost of the U.S. system, and that they are there's the reason that they get referred to as part of the West is because of this. They become like a westernized nation completely. They become a nation in which their constitution is based on the fact that they cannot defend themselves, as we'll get into in a sec. They are wholly reliant on the Western powers, and they are set up as part of the Western Axis in the Cold War too. They are now America light. They have no matter what you believe about the veracity of liberal democracy, it has been forced upon them post nuke.
Yes, nuked into submission. America light. America right? Yes. Anyway, terrible accent aside. Yeah, no, Japan's nothing at this point. It's a shadow of what it used to be, in terms of culture. But as I mentioned before, because of the structure in part because of the structure of their, the way that they industrialized themselves or reindustrialized themselves, they bounced back hard as an economic force. So it wasn't necessarily all terrible all the time for them, but culturally, yeah, it's been absolutely horrendous for Japan. And
they also enacted mass censorship.
Yes.
There's a good bit here. It says in a 1952 book, Concord Press, the MacArthur era in Japanese journalism. They note that the actual application of censorship rules was so confusing and difficult that Japanese newspapers set up censorship desks, where about a dozen men were expected to keep the rest of the paper informed on what the occupation was saying about censorship and what kind of stories were allowed.
That is the nature of propaganda and censorship, though. And once it's in place, you know what? We get that in England under similar terms. Things are curated from the news. Things are managed to a certain light and political doctrine. It is it's horrendous to hear it there. You know what? No, it's horrendous. I hate that shit. But
again, the administration of Germany and the Nazification process is a video in of itself. So is Japanese democracy pre-war as well. But it is a perfect example that liberal values are only ever instilled by illiberal means. You cannot have liberalizing. You can only have illiberal liberalizing.
Yes. I hate the way that's phrased. It makes my brain do a backflip. But you are correct. Liberalizing is the only way to actually instill liberal.
Yeah. Liberal values cannot be enforced and instilled by liberal means.
Yes. Yes. I still find it's got the word liberal used way too many times in it.
It's
makes my brain do a backflip. Which is why liberal democracy and liberal values can never actually be. It is always a hypocrisy. Whether or not that's acceptable is another question.
Do you want to quickly read? It's in the notes. We don't have it on screen, but Article 9 of the 1947 Japanese Constitution, which was essentially imposed on them by the USA by force.
Here we are. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right. Oh God, you've got here. Hold on, what does it say there? Click somewhere else on the screen, dude.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. As a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. So yeah, Japan in their constitution in 1947 have at this point said something that is inalienable as a nation, which is the ability to wage war to settle disputes. They've renounced that right. I don't know if yeah, that's mad.
That's still in their constitution, by the way. They can't threaten force.
Renounce war as a sovereign right, so they can right. They can't. Okay, they can't settle the international disputes by force of war, but they can use force to get people to the table, I think. But they can't threaten to use it either. They just have to. I don't know.
It's the wording. You could have some wiggle room in the wording, but basically what they're saying is Japan cannot be, it cannot have foreign policy anymore.
Yeah.
It cannot have military foreign policy anymore, definitely. And this is all, in the century after this, as we all know, the US runs rampant with its military interventionism. But, the defeated powers, both Germany and Japan, to this day, have military settlements imposed on them by the Second World War that are still binding.
Yes, and it's very financially sort of viable and good for them to have it. Sadly, it causes those communities to have huge amounts of spending and so on. So it works quite well, sort of economically, but yeah, essentially they're an occupied nation.
Oh yeah, there was the whole thing with Obama and Trump. It was wink, wink. If you want to attack the North Koreans, wink, wink. But it's still technically in their constitution. But there is some international wiggle room now for geopolitical reasons, because Japan is very much a piece in the war, or the quiet war on China.
Well, yeah. Whilst they have this sort of in their constitution, they have some very, 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 very capable toys that one might call military, but they're They're not. They're a defence force. They're this, that, and the other. It's various rewordings of things so they're not saying Army, Navy, Air Force, but they have toys. Boy, do they have toys.
We've got a quick quote here. Actually, I don't know whether 1945 to 1950 is still continuously on stream though.
What? Sorry.
The bottom of the screen, 1945 to 1950. Are we just keeping that one?
No, we can get rid of that.
It just might interfere with a couple of the quotes that we've got.
You are right. Yes. Do you want to do the Great Fiction one next?
Yeah, I might contextualize that one. I don't know. You can read it if you want. The context is that he's talking about, there's the idea that democracy prevents war, and that there hasn't been wars between democracies, which is, I don't know, I think that's patently false, since technically Germany and the Soviet Union both thought of themselves as democratic within their own internal logic. But that's different. I don't know. It's, I don't know. Do you want to read that quote, Trig?
Yeah, sure. Where are we going from? Right from the answer is no?
I'll just say with the end of World War II.
Okay, yeah, got you. So, with the end of World War II, essentially, by now, democratic Western Europe and democratic Japan and South Korea in the Pacific region has become part of the US empire, as indicated by the presence of US troops in practically all of these countries. What the post-World War II period of peace then proves is not that democracies do not go to war against each other, but that a hegemonic imperialist power, such as the United States, did not let its various colonial parts go to war against each other, and of course that of the hegemon itself did not see any need to go to war against its satellites, because they obeyed, and they did not see the need, nor did they dare to disobey their master.
Yeah, it's a very salient point, but like South Korea, large parts of places like the Philippines, Japan, Germany, all of these become Western democracies, in quotes, but they're still occupied nations. That Germany and Japan can't go to war against the US again because they are occupied. and a lot of the world can't go to the war against the US because there's military bases there. There's a lot of talk on the left of the American empire, but nobody really tackles it in real terms. In that America just has boots on the ground, fucking everywhere. And the idea that peace is inherent to democracy, again, just ignores the realities of power, which is that from 1945 onwards, a large part of the world are vassal states of what would become NATO or its members. That they are physically occupied by their troops and reliant on their defense, and that their defense is taken out of their hands. Therefore, they become not nation states, but in many ways, supranational vassal states, where they no longer have control over their own military doctrine.
It's almost textbook vassalage, to be honest. It really is. And you're right. For how long has America been basically the only people supplying forces into NATO and that type of thing? It's always been Europe provides tiny little amounts, and by and large, all of our force we just chip in to any war that America decides to go charging off on. Cough, Iraq.
Again, we're not going to cover it here. NATO only starts to exist in mid-49.
Yeah,
and it's really a 1950s organization in response to the Warsaw Pact. But up until this period, like I said, there isn't really an explicit Cold War. They are still, victorious powers who are carving up the world between them. And, you might think that the Japanese government and the Japanese people and the German government and the Japanese people are evil, but you have to think that they're evil for this to be an appropriate way to handle them. That they cannot go and resume self-rule. That there is not this idea that America goes into Germany, Japan, kicks out the dictatorship, and the people welcome them as heroes, and that they are then allowed to have elections again. And the way that they portrayed events in Iraq essentially is not even the way they were trying to portray things here. It wasn't that they were going in to remove leaders that have been imposed on the people. They were going into completely remove their entire system of government and remake it in their image, because they were not democratic, or at least not democratic in the Western sense. And the idea is that in remaking them, they guaranteed world peace. But in remaking them, all they did really, as we've talked about here, was turn them into Western, especially US vassal states. One note I quickly want to make before we move on is that the concept of the third world does not exist yet. It doesn't exist until about 1949, because there's NATO, there's the Warsaw Pact, and everything outside of that during the Cold War was seen as the third world. And a lot of those countries were quite poor, so that's where you get the idea of third world countries being shitholes. But technically the third world is just any country that was never part of NATO or the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah, essentially, because the second world, just basically the definition of that is a communist country.
Yes.
So yes, it was first world, i.e., democratic, second world, communist, and then other. Is literally the third world. It has no bearing technically on them being, shall we say, impoverished.
Let's say.
You know what?
Yeah.
At the same time, absolutely yes, impoverished. They were not wealthy. They had many issues, still do. But that's not what.
You've heard it here first, folks. Third world countries, sometimes poor.
I'll tell you what. Actually, these days, Africa, some parts of Africa are doing very well. No one's mentioning it, but there's some very nice cities in Africa these days.
Yeah, and most of them didn't have lockdowns, apart from South Africa.
Yeah.
Yes, the Nigeria and places like that are actually doing pretty well.
Yes. That's another discussion.
All right. Do you want to intro this next one?
What, Paperclip?
Yes.
We should talk about Paperclip, shouldn't we?
We should do.
Operation Paperclip: The Human Spoils of War, where scientists from the Nazi regime and from anywhere basically suddenly became up for grabs. Not just scientists, people of note with skills that are unusual start getting scooped up left, right, and center at this point.
Oh, a quick point. I don't think you've been transitioning the screens. I think it's still on the whatever preview screen you've got it on, because I'm still seeing Occupation of Japan. So.
Are you really? There's a transition. Yeah. I transitioned it over a minute ago. Let's have a...
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
It might be on my end.
Is it? I don't...
I might just be really far behind. There might be some weird stream lag. So.
Yeah, no, I've got it showing up as the paperclip, the Human Spoils of War.
Yes.
You got it.
My back end has gone weird here and is basically looping a small part of the stream. I'm just going to quickly refresh that. So just give me a second here. Sorry, YouTube is taking a shit as it usually does. Yeah. No, it's not been updating for me. Holy shit, that's annoying.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Trig.
It's all right. No, that's fine.
Sorry, it was actually just looping like 3 seconds of the stream for no reason. Thank you, YouTube. Very cool. I try and keep an eye on what's actually going on in the stream, and YouTube just makes that really difficult. What a horrible platform. Anyway, Sorry, paperclip.
Yeah, so paperclip. Basically, it's a brain drain. It is a let's get anybody that's of interesting and of note, and grab them for the winning countries, i.e., America mostly. Russia was on the game, so was England and France. But yeah, America usually had the deepest pockets, and offered the nicest prizes to some very interesting people. People who you'd have thought, oh, the Nuremberg Trials and things like that are going off. I bet they're rounding up all the SS officers and all the camp commandants and all the people that were literally responsible for carpet bombing cities with rockets. No, they're off getting nice cushy jobs.
Cushy Nazi jobs. The most famous case of this, as we'll talk about, is Verna Von Braun. But it really is Nazi technology, manpower, and technocracy. Really, the technocrats were like transplanted wholesale. The Soviet Union took them and didn't treat them particularly nicely, and the United States did take them and kind of absorbed them into their culture in many cases. And they formed the backbone of the space program, especially for the United States. We've got a picture there of Von Braun in the background. You've just put a few more up. Basically, he met every single president from Truman onwards. Especially, there he is with Lyndon B. Johnson. There he is with Kennedy. Looking around, it seems, because he's not got a hat on either. He's having a bit of a panic there. There he is with Walt Disney. There he is with... there's a picture I think we also have of him getting a medal from Eisenhower. There's a picture of him with I think he's checking out some rockets there with Truman. It's just amazing. And Verna Von Braun is a man who we can definitively prove worked Jews to death. He's actually one of the few people there's a very decent paper trail on in that aspect. In that he was the head of their rocketry program, and they were involved. Basically, they transported all these people like 3 or 4 times to avoid the advance. And he was very nearly involved in the SS's last stand in the mountains where they were building these V2s. And the issue is that really he should have been at the Nuremberg Trials, but he was too useful. And I think that the V2 V3 program. He's Verna Von Braun was head of the program that developed essentially the fuel pumps that allowed the V2s to exist and allowed subsequent space travel to exist. Really, the Saturn V rocket is really just a giant refined multi-stage V2 in that sense.
Oh, totally, totally. Of course it is. It's he launched literally America's space program, but there are also other. I was trying to get another picture of him with him standing there with his mates all in their SS uniforms. He was a full bird SS officer.
He was a major in the SS.
Yeah.
He was a mid-level SS officer. He'd been in the SS on and off since 1933. He was not someone who was a Nazi of convenience. He was an avowed Nazi. He was a man who believed in the program and believed in, for better or for worse, the rocketry program. This was not someone who you could make a very good argument for the fact that he should be spared trial. If, of course, the ideological justification for the Nuremberg trials are true, as we'll get onto, it is a real kind of test case of the fact that really the Nuremberg trials were there as show trials to justify what came afterwards. They had really no objection to Nazis. They had no objection to National Socialists on an ideological level. What they wanted and what they objected to was purely practical and purely power-based. Because if there was true intellectual and ideological revulsion at the ideas of National Socialism and a real thirst for justice for all those who participated in its system, then people like Von Braun would never have been brought to the United States. They would have most likely been executed.
Without a doubt. I mean, there was SS officers that were involved, immediately scooped up by intelligence services, by the CIA, as it was becoming at that point in time, by MI6. If I remember rightly, there was even SS officers that were helping Israel once Israel was founded get its military and secret service up on its feet.
Yes, they ended up all over the world.
They were, and these are, they were scientists. They were great. They helped us go to the moon. No, these guys were professional, the nastiest type of people in the world. They were, very, very dangerous, capable killers. A lot of them, and no, they got the special treatment too. Essentially, the Nuremberg trials were, as far as I can tell, some sort of well, it's not a show, but it was all the people that weren't useful. If they were useful, you got to get out of jail free card. If you were useful, oof, cushy job for you, mate.
Yeah, Germany was not only robbed of its sovereignty; it was robbed of its, essentially its intellect and technical elites. It was an entire strata of German society found itself scattered all over the world. Quite famously, engineers from Mauser ended up in Spain, and that's where they essentially created the G3 rifle. You have, like I said, people like Von Braun in the United States. You had a lot of them who were imprisoned by the Soviet Union. But most of the people who were of technical use to the United States and the Soviet Union, or any other country really, escaped the Nuremberg trials, no matter what they did during the war.
Pretty much. I think France got a couple as well. I think most of
you get a Nazi. You get a Nazi. Everybody gets sorry.
I think there was a little bit of that. Without a doubt, there was a little bit of sharing, but a lot of them went to America. Much bigger rewards for most of them. So anybody else got a second rater, or they particularly wanted to come to England or something. I don't know.
My Nazi's not very good. Can I get a better Nazi, please?
No, you can either have that Nazi or two really substandard ones.
Oh, you're not allowed a better Nazi.
No.
But again, we are... Some of this would seem relatively unconnected to our overarching theme, but we need to talk about all of this because it becomes very important in the later period. And it becomes very important to exposing the fact that most of the rhetoric of the instilling of democracy and punishing the guilty is just that. It's just rhetoric. It's post hoc justification for the United States, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the Allies going, we are doing what we want. We have won, you have lost. Essentially. And there is no elevated factor to it. There is no lack of ugliness that most of the history books would have you believe. There is no, glorious, magnanimous, victorious West. They are quite simply plundering. And they are very willing to accept the worst of the worst if they think it will improve their lot.
Well, it did. Something to be said there, but yeah, it also it attacks the if you will the truth of democracy as well. It shows that democracy is this sham, as you say, and it's just a gigantic party going off at the other end, where, as you say, they are doing what the hell they like. They've won. As with, we're going to move on to the Nuremberg Trials in a second. May as well move over to it now.
Another donation there from Gaius Nonius Caesar. Uncle Sam, this Nazi has a bad motivator, which is a great New Hope reference. But R2 noises in the background.
Uh-huh. Oh. We've had another donation as well.
Yeah, I just read that. We've had another one on the Streamlabs too.
Yeah, we've had a Streamlabs one.
Oh, there we go. IPA is Global Homo Juice, which I think is a great name because I agree most IPAs are terrible.
Yeah.
Scrump, good Substack article with a great fun of paragraph. I hope Evelyn keeps up the research as they've done some interesting insights that have come out so far. And Trig, you keep being Trig. Best wishes to all of you and keep up the good work. Thank you. Thank you. IPA is Global Homo Juice.
That's a great name.
Wonderful name. Wonderful name.
Where were we? Oh yeah, Nuremberg Trials. And
there's we've read it. We've read it twice already, but I want to read it a third time because that quote from Sutton is one of the greatest quotes I think about the Second World War anywhere ever, from Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. I don't know, Trick. I'll let you read this one as well because we said it before, but it's that paragraph about the Nuremberg Trials. It's the end of it.
Yeah, several basic observations can be made from this evidence. First, the Board of American IG had 3 directors from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most influential of the various Federal Reserve banks. American IG also had interlocks with Standard Oil of New Jersey, Ford Motor Company, Bank of Manhattan, later to become the Chase Manhattan Bank, and AEG, German General Electric. Second, 3 members of the board of American IG were found guilty at Nuremberg war crimes trials. These were the German, not the American members. Among these Germans was Max Igner, director of IG Farben, Northwest 7 office in Berlin, i.e. the Nazi pre-war intelligence office. If the directors of a corporation are collectively responsible for the activities of a corporation, then the American directors should also have been placed on trial at Nuremberg along with the German directors. That is, if the purpose of the trials was to determine war guilt. Of course, if the purpose of the trials had been to divert attention away from the US's involvement in Hitler's rise to power, well, they succeeded very well in that objective.
It's just, I'd encourage anyone out there to read Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony Sutton. It's wonderful. He has the receipts. But again, this is a great justification of what we said with Verna Von Braun, in that there is no interest in justice. No. The people who aided and abetted Hitler pre-war within U.S. industry and within very government-linked U.S. industry, because Standard Oil, any Chase Manhattan Bank, the Federal Reserve banks were all really just essentially vassals of the New Deal by the beginning of World War II. And again, you have post-war, you have people like Verna Von Braun being brought into the United States, in that there is no interest in non-performative justice. I think it is completely right to refer to the Nuremberg trials as show trials, because guilt was determined of most people involved before they ever stood trial. And people who should have stood trial never stood trial. And there is really no justification for any of that, apart from, again, we do what we want.
Yeah, essentially. It's expecting honesty out of the government when then you're not going to get that. The Nuremberg trials had to take place. There had to be people held accountable and fingers wagged appropriately in their general direction, and then them taken off to their punishments, whatever that may be. That is the nature of justice. You need to have some bad guys hauled up and told that they're bad, and hopefully they'll repent and cry, and people will get to cheer. As that has to happen, the governments are looking at this situation going, well, this has got to happen. Let's clear up all of the ones that are actually useful. And we'll put okay, this guy was really, really bad. And no one likes him anyway. He can fucking burn. But this guy over here, yes, okay, he may have carpet bombed London with rockets. But he knows how to build rockets. And, we like that. Because we're afraid that Russia might be doing that. And we think it might be the future of all warfare. And so, yeah, they decided that Von Braun and the lads and etc. They kind of cut a break, and it was essentially if you're not very useful and happen to be involved in this and also in the SS, then you were screwed.
Well, there's a lot of recent stuff. There's a story recently about them trying to prosecute a 96-year-old woman who was a typist secretary at one of these camps. And she is being tried for complicity in basically the Holocaust. And in 1944, she will have been 20 years old, and she was a secretary. That is the lengths that the modern German state goes to now to prosecute people. So the idea that someone like Von Braun or the American board members of IG Farben were beyond the pale is ridiculous. There's still this fervent hunger to persecute anyone who had any association with the Nazis, who are still seen as the ultimate enemy of democracy. They are the ultimate people. Nobody will defend the Nazi. Nazis aren't, basically, you saw it in the American election, you saw it with a bunch of Nazi stuff. Nazis aren't people. And that distinction is still there from the Second World War. And it is so powerful it has defined most of what has come after. That friend-enemy distinction we talked about with Schmidt. They use that and exploit that to such a degree that we have a 96-year-old woman standing trial for typing in the 40s, essentially. She was a secretary.
Yeah.
And that is the fervor that there still is. But post-World War II, with the Nuremberg Trials, who was and wasn't a useful Nazi was determined. The other thing when it comes to the Nuremberg Trials is that the Nuremberg Trials are what enshrines in public consciousness the idea of international justice and the validity and neutrality of international courts, that there are supranational organizations above the sovereignty of nations. This is one of the... It really is the first time that legality is established above a national sovereignty level. What could and should have happened is Germany should have formed a new government, and then that new German government should have tried the people who were considered war criminals.
Yeah.
Who had done, crimes against the German people. But this is not what happened, because the German people were not seen as trustworthy to try their own leaders. Which again is a bit of a weird one. If they were popular enough not to be tried, then surely democracy doesn't particularly work. But anyway, the self-defeating nature of that is for a kind of a logical episode on the subject of democracy.
Yeah.
This is historical context, but the idea here that there is such thing as an international court and international justice, and these institutions are neutral and above the level of national power is a huge change. A huge change. It is a huge departure from even what we saw in the wake of World War I, in which treaties were imposed and nations signed the treaties, and the nation signed the treaty was seen as the legitimizing factor. Here we have, again, supranational justice and supranational courts, and they've been used semi-occasionally since, but the idea of international law as a justification for either prosecution or military action really didn't exist in the pre-World War II era.
No, I mean, they tried. This was the whole point of the League of Nations, was to have a world government. You can't have a world government without a set of world laws. So whether or not this was a conscious decision by people, or we slipped into it via the League of Nations and other things, but yes, there suddenly became this international law, international justice. Largely, as you say, if Italy had decided to attack Ethiopia, as long as no one had any treaties with either Ethiopia or Italy, no one would actually bat an eyelid either way. It was when people had, Ethiopia's my neighbour, I've got trade agreements with him, I've also signed a mutual defence pact, so I might be drawn in, and so on and so forth. But now that's gone, somehow, for some reason. Can't say, I mean, that was the end of the First World War. People realised that was dragging, that had dragged everybody. Well, they said that is what had dragged everybody into the First World War.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a cover story if you ask me, but
yeah. Well, to be fair, we went over that in great detail. Why that's more of a cover story than it is reality.
We did, but they're using the same cover story again.
They are, yes. What they're saying is that international courts, as legitimized by international democracy,
yes,
are the solution. And we don't see it really again into the 1990s, but international courts are generally used when the sovereignty of a nation is completely overruled by some supranational force. Like what happened with the collapse of Yugoslavia. And basically what happened to the Serbs is that they ended up in a similar situation in which their populist and popular leaders were removed from power, and they were told, no, you cannot have or do this anymore within your own borders. It's a case when the international community comes in and decides that a sovereign nation is no longer acting in a quote-unquote responsible manner, which is, again, an extremely strange distinction to make if you are not the bad guys in some way. No, it's the idea that there is a neutral and inherently good aspect to having the power to do this, and that it can't be, it isn't a giant blank check for misuse.
And it is as well. I mean, anyone that's done any sort of international business knows that dealing with America is a very one-sided affair if you're not careful. Same with China. Etc. A lot of countries like in Europe and in England, you're on the back foot a little bit with, and we're friends. America has been sort of imposed itself as a distinct de facto sovereign empire as a result of all of this, because they're the police force for this new international justice, and the leverage that has given them over the UN has meant it's been a very one-sided international law.
It's like the quote from Hopper again there. It is not democracy, it is hegemony.
Yeah.
And that democracy in of itself, created by hegemony, is a bit of a lie. It's there as a post hoc form of consent. And again, like you said, the idea that this is what has brought about peace, again, is very backwards logic, because the reality of power is what has stopped military action taking place against the US. not democracy, and certainly not the idea of international law and international justice.
No. These are they're certainly there that can be circumvented, as and when the sovereign nations that rule so deem it necessary, as we've seen. Oh, these guys are useful. No, doesn't count.
Well, it's very, we're invading Iraq now.
Yeah. What do you mean we need to find weapons of mass destruction? They just hid them really well, Mr.
If international courts and international justice was truly neutral and administered in a distributed way throughout the nations of the world, Tony Blair and George Bush and their entire cabinets and many of the technocrats would have stood trial in them.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, we have bought peace and security. Again, more Star Wars quotes from guys. he's on a roll there. Thank you. Thank you for the $2 too. Dear me. But no, it's something to ruminate on, really. It's something to ruminate on when we come to. We're really talking about the supranational national stuff in this episode. We'll talk about like the nitty-gritty of Western democracy next time. But I've left this time because the big discussion at the end of this I'm going to have is about what has been left in the East and the great, I guess, sin of the Western powers, which is pointed out by some of the time period to their credit, that they have essentially abandoned Eastern Europe to its fate. That they, even when we get to 1949 and there's talk of containment is not about liberating Eastern Europe. Containment is about stopping the spread of communism from where it is currently. Nobody is talking about liberating Poland. No one's talking about liberating Hungary. No one's talking about liberating Romania. Nobody's talking about liberating any of the nations that have fallen behind what Churchill referred to as the Iron Curtain. And again, it smacks of hypocrisy that both Patton to a lesser extent and Churchill were working with the Soviet Union to overtake these countries and promising them right up until 1945. And then, there is this slow realization within Western populace that maybe to some degree we fought the wrong guy.
Yeah. Literally, well, there's a quote, and I can't source it. I was trying to source it earlier. And it was one of the parades that was being held in Moscow at the end of the Second World War, and they were parading their latest tanks, etc. through. And there was an American and a British, either high-ranking general or it was FDR. It wouldn't have been FDR and Churchill, but I think maybe Churchill. Either way, that's what the way I remember the quote being. Is they saw the tanks that were rolling down the street, the IS-1s and IS-3s, I think it was, at the time, and just literally went, okay, we fought the wrong enemy. These are terrifying. We do not have the military arms to crack tanks of that scale. And sure, those parades were a show of force, but yeah, they're definitely the along with what the communist Russia was like and what Stalin was like, what was becoming much more evident about them. There was a definite we fought the wrong enemy feeling from a lot of people. Perhaps they were both enemies. Perhaps it could have been just a case of just push them towards each other a little more and then wipe the floor straight through. The old... who was it that wanted to rearm the Nazis at the end of the Second World War and push through?
General Patton.
It was Patton, wasn't it? Yes.
I can't source the quote from him right now. It's quite famous that he wanted that to happen. But General Patton also commented that he wasn't in favor of the whole denazification thing and compared the controversy over Nazism to a Democratic and Republican election fight, he basically rightly identified the fact that Nazism is really just another political ideology among all the other political ideologies. And it's singling out as this verboten evil thing that is very, very special is just wrong. It is just factually incorrect. And it really is just a friend-enemy distinction, as we've talked about, a few times over the past few shows, that the idea that Nazism is different than any other socialistic political system that demands mass interventionism from the state is wrong. It is completely comparable and incredibly similar in many ways to even what FDR was doing at the time, in the 30s. I mean, he's dead at this point. Yay, stupid cripple. But his legacy lives on.
Damn. Oh, it's mean. He couldn't walk. Yeah, no, it's where was I? That's a great quote, and he's right. It's difficult to sort of you have it drummed into you from such an early age that Nazi equals evil. But no, he is right. It is just a political doctrine, and certainly no worse than communism that we've seen in many of its forms.
Patton incidentally, he dies in a car crash in December 1945 in rather ignominious circumstances. There's a lot of people who think he was got out of the way deliberately. I'm of the opinion that Patton was killed.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. I've heard that before. Patton made a lot of people loved him. He was very Marmite, shall we say? I know he and Monty did not get on how the war across Europe should take place after the D-Day. Patton wanted to charge like crazy. Monty was like, "No, you're going to be fighting through hedgerows. Take it slowly." I think Patton perhaps might have had a point, but good God, it would have been a bloodbath. But was he bumped off? Maybe. I don't know. I hate to see these sort of spooks around every corner, but yeah.
No, I know, but Patton's an interesting one, because he was so one of the few people who's vocally opposed to denazification, to the destruction of German society to a complete degree, to its complete removal and rebuilding. That that there could be no elected politicians in Germany without completely propagandizing the population to consider themselves evil. It is a point of history that we don't like talking about, but we'll get into it in some episode maybe at some point, but the denazification process becomes the template for deracinating a people, for removing them from everything else before, and essentially year zeroing them.
Yeah.
And I think Patton possibly saw some of that coming. He was certainly an inconvenient voice because he was such a war hero. But we will never know. That's the thing. But I think balance of probability is that it's unlikely someone as senior as Patton would have been killed in the manner that he was.
I think that's a hypothesis that may have value. Yeah. I've got to stop saying all the time. But he could have been. It certainly would have been nice to have seen a war or a post-Europe, post-Second World War with Patton in it. I think it was a sad loss. But yeah, maybe bumped off. There was a lot of that happening, but
there's a lot of coincidences.
There was a lot of people dying in car accidents back then.
That's true.
It did happen quite a lot to random people.
Yeah, Evan Seeger said, fun fact, the drunk soldier, he got killed by a drunk driver, essentially. The drunk soldier driver who was driving the truck that killed Patton was let off without any major charges.
Drunk driving gets you, all manner these days, but yeah. So he was. It does stink a bit, doesn't it?
It do be stinking. Though. But the other one I want to mention before we go into some of the wider political discussion about like just how horrendous the situation was in the East even before the Cold War. The other one was Churchill. Have you heard of Operation Unthinkable?
Only briefly from the name, but from what I've read of it after looking at it, I am kind of aware that it was. The thing is, a government, when they are in any given situation, will be planning in many different directions and build up operations on how to do various things, without them being policy, shall we say. So
yeah,
to hear that this operation existed, not surprising.
But it's another, again, case of Winston Churchill being slightly ahead of the curve with the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
The sacrifice of the East, though, becomes this engineered stalemate in which both the United States and eventually the United Kingdom, because Churchill gets, obviously booted midway through 45, yes. But it ends up being this perfect storm that is very deliberately, in a later period, engineered, in that there's not enough impetus and not enough agitation and propaganda to make people want a hot war against the Soviet Union. But there's enough rhetoric there to set up the Cold War dynamic that allows these blank checks on both sides to form. That essentially both sides very quickly begin to realize that, the situation is incredibly beneficial to both parties. Because a lot of what happens, there's the Berlin airlift and there's a lot of saber rattling, but that's all it is. It's saber rattling. And what happens with Stalin is it's a no-lose situation for America, because either Stalin cooperates with them, becomes part of this kind of grand new world order that they wish to impose that is, supernatural. And supranational, sorry, not supernatural. We're not quite there yet. And is, the idea that the UN will actually govern the world, or Stalin and the Soviet Union get set up as these patsies for the Cold War, and they become the new enemy. And that is obviously the most likely outcome, because Stalin's not playing ball already, but it's this situation in that, yes, they really could have just rolled Stalin back up to Moscow, because this whole plan of Operation Unthinkable was about giving the Soviets a kick in the nuts to essentially relinquish Poland, because Britain had fought all this war predicated on the invasion of Poland, and it's a horrendous embarrassment to Churchill, I think, that despite his fag packet negotiations with Stalin, that Poland is not free.
Yeah,
they fought a war for Poland, and Poland is occupied and continues to be occupied until the 90s, really. And the idea that the Second World War was a war for freedom just evaporates moment by moment as we move towards 1950, as we realize that the Americans, even though when it's sorry, I'm being retarded again, because we're not going to talk about it in this time period, but August 49 was when the Soviets got the atomic bomb. So the Americans have 4 years of atomic monopoly. And the idea that they could not have bullied Stalin back into his own borders is ridiculous, because they were the only people who had nuclear weapons. There was no mutually assured destruction at this time.
No.
And they had shown the effectiveness of them, and they had essentially used Nagasaki and Hiroshima as threats.
But they'd also potentially used up all of their fissile material at that point. They didn't have a working bomb after Nagasaki for a short period of time. But yes, it was the race was on, and they definitely had a massive head start on that. And you're right, they could have very easily gone, do this or Moscow go by.
Yeah.
And Stalin wouldn't have been able to do a darn thing about it, but it would have meant tensions were on. That would have been it. It would have been full war. So they better have had multiple, and it would have ended very quickly. Russia would have been gone.
We'll talk about it maybe slightly in another episode, but there's a huge amount of iffiness in that there is a wink and a nod that the US must have known the scale of leaks that they had, because they were employing avowed communists within the Manhattan Project.
Yes.
And they, like, the idea that comprehensive nuclear secrets could make it into the hands of the Soviet Union without someone somewhere being alerted to it is a little absurd. I've heard some very convincing arguments that really the Americans, or at least certain parts of the American administration and the American establishment, wanted nuclear parity, and they wanted this mutually assured destruction situation because it would be, one, it would make a balance of power a bit more, it would essentially enshrine the Cold War in stone.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not saying that the entire American establishment wanted this, because they didn't. They certainly didn't. But members of it, especially those who were very leftward inclined or very militaristic inclined, for that matter, must have known how advantageous it would be to have a situation where both sides had the bomb. There's a lot of, it seems unthinkable, but you have to think the unthinkable when you look at history like this. Again, it's 4 years, though. The US has 4 years of nuclear monopoly, and they don't march Stalin out of Poland. They don't march Stalin out of East Germany. Because really, I suppose to them it might be slightly hypocritical, because they really were setting up Germany and Japan as essentially democracy vassal states, and Stalin just wanted his own vassals.
Yeah, I don't know why they didn't poke that particular bear harder, to be honest.
Sorry, go on, Trig.
Russia had a huge military force, though. Huge military force. They're on-the-ground troops, very, very, very large and seasoned, nasty fighters. Yeah? They were in the process of winding down. They could have... If they have the bomb, yes, they can win. But on a ground war against Russia, nobody ever does well. It must have been in the back of your mind. If you go to war against Russia, you piss them off, and they go, "No, we're going to fight here. Here are all of our tanks, and we're just going to keep throwing them at you," which is what they do. You've then got to work out whether or not you can fight in Russian temperatures, which everyone can't.
The idea wouldn't be an invasion of Russia. The idea would be to make them concede to your demands on Eastern Europe, which is, I think, very viable. The only way I can read history is that throughout this period they were delaying and delaying and delaying, because they were trying to wait for Stalin to come back on side almost. They were either waiting for Stalin to come back on side, or they were setting up for the Cold War and had no intention. They had no intention of ever liberating. That the liberation of Eastern Europe was not a priority to them. They actually didn't care.
I think it's the latter. I think the other thing is you've got nuclear weapons. Great, now deliver them. We're not talking about ICBMs. We're talking about bombs to be dropped by planes. Yes. And the Russian Air Force, not something that people go on about a huge amount, but the Russian Air Force was capable of putting some very interesting aircraft in the skies in the late 40s and onwards. Getting a bomber to Moscow might have been difficult. So your nuclear deterrent is not maybe as certain as you want. I'm just saying, why didn't they? It would be poking a very aggressive bear, and there were a lot of uncertainties for them. It wasn't like delivering a bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which was fly through essentially safe air, drop package, return. Carrying a nuclear bomb via bomber into Russian airspace in those years would have been a very scary proposition.
Yeah, it would be, but it's again, the situation in which they essentially leave the East to its fate is it's the great cardinal sin at the end of World War II, and it's it's the thing that allows the Cold War to happen, and the sacrifice of the East. I think whether if not deliberate, it is by nature of the fact that it happened allowed to happen.
Yeah.
And according to their own doctrine, according to why they got into World War II, this situation should be unthinkable and intolerable, and yet it is allowed to persist.
Without a doubt. Poland got fucked completely, well and truly fucked once again. They always do. So it's a real sad fact of history is that Poland seemed to get fucked over. That area of Europe has been fucked over so many times by Europe, by Russia, by the Ottomans, and so on. They've borne the brunt. And been,
you're right. It is the latter because, as they're mentioning in chat, that the Soviet Union was armed almost completely using the resources of the Western Allies. Stalin's military was in shambles at the beginning of the war, as is shown by the collapse after the invasion, after the Blitzkrieg. They were on life support from mass amounts of US raw materials and technology. They were essentially, Stalin was their guy, as I keep saying. He was the stooge at the beginning of the period of the West to replace Lenin. He was given, again, factories, technology, and manpower for a second 5-year plan. It's something that's, we talked about previously, but people just don't talk about. That Stalin was given another shot in the arm to the Soviet economy using, Western methods, Western supplies from capitalist companies. It's hilarious, but it happened. He has been pumped full of American money. He has been supercharged. He is only this military superpower because of this. And really this shows to the play acting of what was going on, that he is a creation of the US, industrial complex. He is a creation of the Western Allies. And they have no interest in fighting their own dog. And either he decides to have a change of heart and join them, or he becomes the new stooge. But there's never going to be a hot war. Again, I will spoil the Cold War for people when we do post-democratization. The Cold War is a lie. It is a lie perpetuated by both sides because it benefits them, because the situation allows you to have an enemy. And we see that in fruition once the Cold War ends and the US struggles for an enemy until 9/11. When one magically appears out of the sky.
It
is almost a religious moment for the US, industrial complex and intelligence state when 9/11 happens. It is their savior, which is why the event is so fucking fishy. It's so perfect for them. But anyway, both the Soviet Union and the US need the enemy. Like, there's a lot of stuff about how despondent the Western world was, and a lot of the Western higher-ups were, the Western intelligence services and military services were, when the Cold War ended. They hated it. They didn't want the Cold War to end. They were so upset when the Soviet Union collapsed because their entire justification for existence was predicated on the Soviet Union as their enemy. And very quickly, I think, in the time period we're talking about here, at least a section of especially the American establishment, begins to realize this. When they can't bring Stalin back on side, they begin to realize that, he needs to be essentially propped up. He needs to continue to be propped up. He needs to be provoked in rhetoric. But militarily, I think he would have, the Soviet Union still has purges ongoing during this period. Internally, the Soviet Union was as ravaged as anybody by the Second World War. They had this period of having to look inwards and build up they needed the plunder from, the Iron Curtain countries, from, the Warsaw Pact countries, to rebuild the Soviet Union economy after the Second World War. Such was the collapse. You end up with a Holodomor and things like that as well. You end up with all famines in all these Soviet nations too, because they don't have the resources. They're collapsing under their own weight, even as they are victorious in World War II. And I will probably repeat this ad nauseum if we ever do post-democratization, but the idea that the Cold War defines this era, that all these people are terrified of a war, when essentially they're laughing at us behind closed doors, because they know there is never going to be a hot war. They know this. Both sides know this, and both sides set up lines of communication to make that impossible. It is a complete farce. But anyway, I think it's very apparent from how they handle Stalin in this period that there is really, containment by its very nature is only containment. They are never talking about the liberation of the communist nations. They are only talking about the enforcement of the status quo by definition. Containment is actually the enforcement of the existence of the Warsaw Pact. It's a weird way to think about it, but it is.
Yes, the Warsaw Pact became necessary because of NATO, and vice versa. One creates the other. I don't know. I'm just the whole idea that there could never have been. It could never have gone hot, is your mutually assured destruction. There were moments when it got very, very, very tense. Bay of Pigs is the obvious one, but there were others as well, where ordnance has been sort of lost and had to be recovered.
Oh yeah, a lot of that is due to low-level incompetence, though.
Yes, but certainly at any point, it could have gone wrong. If only by incompetence, if only because someone who was supposed to be sort of guarding a missile depot decided to have a drink one night or come back in and lean on the wrong button and accidentally launch missiles.
That's the thing. That's almost the command and control systems, both in the East and the West, but it's hard because it's heavily classified. But from what I've heard, launching a nuclear missile is almost impossible. There's so many layers.
Okay, this is no longer classified. But for the longest time, the unlock code was basically I think it was either tap 1 or tap 0 8 times. It was the same number over and over and over again. Also, a lot of the missile sites on site had a manual, literally run over and press button type, and it will fire at the target that it's pre-loaded for. Those are the close and medium range ones. The ICBMs are a bit different, but there's more time to deal with those. Yes, there's a huge network of communication, but it always comes down to some bloke running over and pressing a big red button, by and large.
The thing is, I don't think that would have actually started a nuclear war, because I think so many people are aware of that, and there were so many military mistakes that didn't end up creating war because both sides understood that situation could arise. I think the idea of a large-scale, politically led nuclear conflict, that somebody somewhere would go, right, they've done too much, push the button, end the world.
There's at this point there's too much levels of bureaucracy and political intrigue. There's no one's going to press the big red button and wipe out the world, because then tomorrow's going to be a crap day for everybody. So
I don't think it's. I think purely framing it as mutually assured destruction is incorrect. There isn't. It's not the fact that there's political will and the only thing stopping them is the idea that mutually assured destruction. I think mutually assured destruction as a doctrine is very powerful, and it certainly is a great way of justifying why you're not destroying the enemy. But I think at the top level in both the US and the USSR, there was never the political will for nuclear war. Never mind the military realities, as we saw from 45 to 49. There was no mutually assured destruction. Yes, there was problems with delivery, but the reason that America didn't nuke Stalin was a lack of political will. It wasn't the actual situation on the ground. And I think that was the case throughout the Cold War, that the idea that a military leader on either side of the Iron Curtain would want to push the button, I think was incorrect.
No,
maybe Nixon.
I don't know. I don't even think Nixon would have done that. It was a point where we've built these toys, these nuclear weapons, and now we've managed to jinx everyone into not having them. All it does is basically you make nuclear weapons, and suddenly everyone goes, welcome to our not using nuclear weapons club. And in doing so, you get a seat at this table, and you get nice treaties and stuff. Which is why people were a bit iffy about North Korea getting nuclear weapons. Pakistan and India, it gained them a little bit of respect in international dealings, shall we say. It's reason why Pakistan hasn't been stomped on for some of their dealings in the, recent history. They have nuclear weapons, but no one uses them, because if you do use them, that's it.
Well, there's nuclear weapons are one of the most interesting things when it comes to ANCAP arguments, essentially, because nuclear weapons have never been owned by private individuals. There is actually no market demand for nuclear weapons, and there is very little apart from a film where you ransom like a country, like a Hollywood film, which I don't think practically would work. But there is actually no market demand for the destruction that a nuclear weapon has. That there is no private will for nuclear warfare. It is purely an abstraction of nation states, which I think is a very powerful and true point. That really humanity, I think that if we're working from like we do a Rothbardian framework, it actually has a much more, again, rosy view of humanity, that they're really, all of this abstraction, all of this coercion has to be put in place. All of this has to happen for people to have nuclear weapons and threaten each other with them. In a collapse situation, people aren't thinking about, laughs in McNuke. People aren't thinking about using nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are, in the old world, impractical.
Yes.
Nuclear weapons don't just come about because of technology. They come about because the old world has been so utterly destroyed. In a world of fighting aristocrats who want to force their enemy to cede, percentages of land and resources and get their peasants to gather grain, nuclear weapons are insane because they destroy what you're trying to conquer.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've always wondered why they don't do more. Let's using nuclear weapons as EMPs to knock out large. That's a whole different matter. And you're not even doing much damage physically to anyone down there, because it's very high altitude. Yes, it gets a flash. Yes, some people really close to not by get probably a bit of a shall we say, a bit of a suntan. But by and large, suddenly everyone's computers don't work. Everyone's TVs don't work. everyone's electronics don't work, and that as a prelude to an actual physical invasion is quite a powerful one.
Oh yeah, no, I'm more talking about the fact that a lot of the literature which justifies the existence of coercive nation states is posited on the idea that the natural state of man is warfare.
Yes.
But there has to be, as has been studied hugely, most people in wars don't shoot at each other.
Oh yeah. It's something like 10,000 rounds with an LMG to do the work of one sniper. More often than not. Certainly the thing is, man does not want to start shooting complete stranger as far as he's concerned to him. He might want to start shooting a bit more accurately at him after he's killed a few of his mates. But by and large, if it's just random person shoot, no. Most people would rather not be involved in murdering somebody they've never met.
It takes a huge amount of rhetoric, as well as we've seen, to create the idea of the enemy that is so potent that you must kill him, especially if he's not invaded your lands. Defensive and civil wars are different, but again, it's actually very hard to make humans engage in extremely large-scale conflict. And what we've seen here is that democracy is one of the only things really that has been instrumental in motivating people into these mass acts of death, and that the creation of the mentality of a society on a national level. Yeah, Lindy Bates does a video about this. It's quite good.
It's not just the mentality; it's the ability to go right.
Yeah.
Conscription time. Everyone on the everyone on the helicopters. You're going to Nam.
It's the power there. It's the credit expansion to pay for the weapons.
Yeah.
The modern war is only available with the tools of the modern state. It is impossible, impractical, and undesirable prior to this era. And it is not due to the neutral upward trending of history. I think we have hopefully completely debunked that view in people's minds. If not, I would advise you to maybe start this series again or look at slightly more basic literature, to be honest, because you are still subsumed in the Hegelianism. But it's an interesting point that there's so much abstraction, so much framework, and so much effort must be put in to persuade people to even want to kill each other in this way.
We were taught / trained even in the 80s that at any given moment Russia could get uppity and start pushing forwards with its tanks, and the NATO forces would have at most 7 days before all of Europe was lost completely to that push. They'd pretty much determined that there was no stopping Russia if they'd wanted to, with the amount of arms that they had. Now, that's what was being told to the general public in the 80s and 70s. Whether or not that was real or not, whether that's true or not, it certainly builds on a certain amount of fear for
the reality was that Russia at that time had such supply problems, they probably couldn't fuel that many tanks at once.
No.
I mean, one of the great things about the end of the Cold War, again, we're getting very far at the time period here, but we need to talk about this when we talk about what's happened in the East in this time period, is that we get to the Soviet Union in the 90s, and they are hollowed out. They are this crumbling paper tiger. They have to sell their ships to Pepsi. Look that up. Look up the Pepsi Navy, by the way. Their nuclear submarines are leaking water and radiation. Most of their equipment is inoperable. They just barely have a functioning deterrent. They are so preoccupied internally with this almost constant near collapse that they experience throughout the Soviet Union that they are not looking, there's a lot of saber rattling militarily, but in terms of large-scale military operation, I don't think the Soviet Union is ever fully ready to mobilize against the West. There is never that push-the-button moment where they could have strong-armed Europe. I think that they would have crumbled internally before they did, as we saw what happened with Afghanistan. They are not a nation that is capable of a sustained mechanized war because of the ineptitude of central planning.
Well, this is the big tragedy of Russia, isn't it? Is what started off with the death of the Tsars and the communist revolution has just literally eaten the heart out of what should be a gigantic, economically gigantic as well as is just freaking huge, because Russia, man, that's big. It should be a massive force to be reckoned with economically, scientifically, etc., etc. But it's gone because they've annihilated their youth. Anyone that wasn't ideologically pure, anyone that had the ability to think outside of what they were told, gone.
Yes,
it's just the annihilation of a nation. Horrendous.
It is horrible and it's depressing. But again, this isn't. People accuse us of being black pill, but that's not black pill. That's honestly kind of white pill. With the fact that there really could not have been, barring multiple bilateral acts of incompetence in a row, extreme incompetence. There could not really have been nuclear war during the Cold War. There just was not the desire for it.
No.
But going back to what's happening in the East here, the Cold War itself is entirely avoidable. They could have nipped it in the bud right here. There's the historical narrative. There wasn't the political will. Stalin was still our ally and he betrayed us. And there's the back and forth. The normal kind of historical narrative is that the Soviet Union started the Cold War. The leftists say that the Americans started the Cold War, and there's this finger pointing back and forth. There isn't really much talk about whether or not the Cold War itself was constructed by both sides for mutual gain and profit, which really is what happened. And whether it was avoidable in the first place. Those two things are never discussed. The avoidability of the Cold War and the fact that the Cold War is a construct of both sides, which it is. It takes two to tango, as I kept saying when we were talking about who funded the Nazis. Europe could very easily have put horrendous sanctions on Hitler in 33, 34 and crippled his rearmament effort. But there wasn't, again, he was seen as a modern political actor with a modern political philosophy, as Lloyd George talks about. Same with the Soviet Union. There could have been this early action to cripple them post-World War II. Yeah, cui bono. It could not. The idea that it could not have happened any other way, the neutrality of history, the ever march upward is the thing that we're trying to debunk most here, because that is the entire basis that democracy rests on. That we are here because we are the culmination of hundreds of years of human technological thought, uplifting every man towards the heavens. It's childish thinking, and yes. I would hope that we can continue to demolish that within people's minds. But sorry, I've rambled long enough. We've pretty much reached the end of the stream. Trig, is there anything you want to add for this last point?
No, I think you've pretty much nailed it. I was lost then for a second. How to put it? Oh, I've lost it. Russia's died. It's a stark warning that the tyranny that is communism and what that can do, and whether or not the Cold War was manufactured by both sides. I think it was. I'm not going to get into how and why in particular, but it was beneficial. It's beneficial to have a villain for a nation to rally against, and in Cold War gives you a villain without actually having to face it. You can just saber rattle and go, all those people over there, they're terrible. Nobody ever goes over there. And don't go over there and don't speak to them. They're evil, and if you go over there, they'll corrupt you. We've got to build a really high wall and some nice big guns to defend against them, because that's what they're doing over there. I've got this telescope. And that's what was happening. The general people in Russia are hearing that America is going to kill them at any given moment, and must work harder for our dear leader. Meanwhile, the West is being told that communism is terrible, and oh my God, have you seen the pictures of these people queuing up for bread? God, aren't they pathetic? And yet they want to kill us and kill our babies in our beds, and subject the whole world to this kind of life. Let's make sure they don't. Support our troops in Vietnam, etc. And God, it would have been. It's kind of good that Russia didn't thrive, but it's terrible that it didn't as well. The damage it did to the people, is horrendous, and by and large, Russian people seem to be. Well, I've met some interesting ones. No, they weren't all strippers or anything like that, but yeah. No, it's an interesting nation, and their histories.
Yeah, there's
been very sad.
They mentioned Chomsky has actually a similar opinion of the Cold War, but I think it's just so obvious. Like, the fact that it isn't the prevailing opinion of the Cold War is baffling to me, because it's so obvious that that's what it was.
Well, yes, and it baffles me, because usually international trade is significantly more beneficial than hiding behind wall and flogging your people to work for the country's benefit, because the other group over there is scary.
Well, there's huge trade going on within each bloc. But anyway, I think we need to talk about the Cold War when we get to it. I just wanted to go in that discussion properly, because we can look forward a bit, and it's important to note that really their failure to deal with the post-war world is what, whether you believe it was natural or manufactured, is what brought about the Cold War. And that the Cold War is not inevitable. It had to be either engineered or allowed to happen. I think that's the point. We were both dancing around a little bit there, but
yes.
Sorry, my voice is getting quite sore, as you can probably hear. So I'm going to have to go pretty soon. Is there anything you need to shill, Trig, before we end the stream?
No. All I'm still doing this D&D on Mondays on my channel. I've got to get my arse in gear and finish off my Deus Ex run through as well, and generally sort of that type of stuff. But other than that, no. I'm being pretty chill at the moment. I'm focusing on this. Yes.
I think I did all my shilling at the beginning of the stream. I didn't put it in the. I'll probably put it in the description for the VOD, but I'll just give a quick additional shill to the Anti-Politics Substack, because we've actually been putting stuff up there this week. We've got 2 articles up there, so I'll re-shill that. But apart from that, I'm gonna have to go rest my voice now. So I'm gonna say goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Oh, there's no goodbye from him. You've ruined it, Trent.
I've ruined it. Yeah, well.
We'll see you guys later.
Yeah, good night.